Vic is not able to make it. I want to be able to see this. I want to be able to see the screen.
Yeah, I know. Maybe we can be up here for introduction.
Just for introduction and then go down. I want to be able to see the screen.
Yeah, and then come back up for the discussion.
You are the smartest woman I've ever met.
Well, I'm sure we're ready whenever you're ready.
Boy, you can solve problems quickly.
Yeah, let's just plan on doing it.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. The first public hearing of the Providence Board Boundaries Committee. On behalf of the committee, I welcome you all here for this very important evening. My name is Jessica. I'm the chair of the committee. I'm a public member and I live in Ward 3. I have with me Councilman Harris of Ward 11 and Councilor Miller of Ward 13. And we also have two other committee members who weren't able to join us tonight, Nick Freeman of Ward 5 and Councilman Murphy of Ward 4. So across the country, cities and states are redrawing their new boundaries, voting boundaries, using the census data that just came out in 2020. So we asked everyone to do the 2020 census, and then one of the main goals of that census data is to use it to redraw our political boundaries. Tonight is just the first in a series of meetings that we're going to have over the next month and 2 weeks. I want to let everyone know that we haven't run any maps yet. This is a time to reflect on the census data and to gather information from you all, gather testimony from you. And then once we have had some time to hear from the community, we're going to go through the process of drawing maps and bringing it back to you in order to get your feedback and finalize those maps. So this is a journey that we've only just begun. We're really excited about that. So you'll see some maps tonight, but they are the current wards. These aren't the wards that have been redrawn. We do have the current 2020 data. So just a quick overview of tonight's agenda is we're going to go over our committee's responsibility in our work to date. There's going to be a presentation from our consultant election data services, and then we'll have public comments. I ask you all to keep your comments specific to the redrawing. You will have 3 minutes, and then if you have any questions, you can refer them to me, and we can either try to get them answered right away, or if we can't answer them, we'll try to get your contact information. That way we can be sure to answer your questions. And then quickly, as a committee, I'd like to thank my fellow members. We've been working for almost a year unofficially, and now we're starting our official process, and we're really excited. I'd like to thank the council president and his staff, all of the city councilors who are here, and those who have been in our other meetings, the city clerk and all of her staff who have set up all of the technology. I know that we have the IT department here as well this evening helping us. The staff in the solicitor's office and the purchasing and planning department have also touched this committee over the past year, so I really thank them for their work. This is definitely a team effort across city government, and I just want everyone to know how much time and effort has gone into it. I'd like to thank the Providence Public Schools for hosting us this evening. And I've actually had the privilege to go out and talk to lots of different community folks, including Liza Birkin with the Providence Coalition of Neighborhood Associations. I've talked with Al Jeffries and the folks at the South Elmore Neighborhood Association. I've talked with Dwayne Keys and the South Providence neighborhood associations tomorrow night. I had the opportunity to talk with the resident advisory board, the Providence Housing Authority, the Fox Point Neighborhood Association, Amy Mandillo helps me set that up. Sharon Steele, the Jewelry District, Doug Victor of the Elmwood and South Providence Neighborhood Crime Watch, Black Lives Matter with Anika Ross, DARE and Christopher Rotundo, the Providence League of Women Voters, Joan Census helped me up there. So just want everyone to know that we've done a lot of boots on the ground for chatting with the neighborhood folks, getting the word out there. We still have work to do in getting out and talking to community members. So we encourage you to reach out to us and tell us who else we should be chatting with and hopefully gather information from. Okay. Some fellow committee members have anything that they need to add or say this time? No. Oh. We do have Spanish language interpreters here, and I think their service. Does anyone need that service? Thank you.
Yes, Chairwoman.
Of course.
I just want to, this is not. How about now? Nope.
Gonna hold it down a bit. So it goes green.
Use the other one.
All right.
How about this? Okay.
All right, thank you, Chairwoman. Did it go away? No. I'll just speak very loud. Oh, no. Okay. So thank you, Chairwoman. I just want to also say, I'm Councilor Miller. This is the first time that in Providence where we have had a non-elected official, like a community member, lead the committee. And I think that is tremendously exciting and important for a bunch of reasons. For transparency, for accountability. I'm really glad that the council president at the time took this position. It's also a lot of work. So I want to thank our chairwoman and the other community member, Nick Freeman, who's not here tonight, for kind of volunteering and playing this role in bringing the community together and in helping us analyze the data.
I'd just like the audience to know if you're on Zoom, we are only using that for viewing purposes. If you do have a question or comment or testimony, please feel free to email us at wardboundaries@providenceri.gov. Next, I'd like to go over in just brief detail why we're redrawing the boundaries. We are, by law, required to do this in our home rule charter. It's actually Article 2, Section 204. We have 6 criteria that we must use when we redraw these boundaries. First, we must keep the ward's population as equal as possible. So that's the main reason for redrawing. We know Providence population has changed over the decade. And so in order to reset on a new population tool, we redraw the boundaries. Second, we must have our wards be contiguous within each ward. Third, our wards must comply with the Voting Rights Act. And fourth, we are going to consider using communities of interest. And you're going to hear a lot about communities of interest over the next few weeks. These are where the community tells the committee what is important to them, what area is important to them in their neighborhood, in their part of the city they live. You can draw your community of interest, you can tell us, but those are things that we will consider when we're redrawing boundaries to make sure that we're not splitting neighborhoods in half when at all possible, and keeping communities full. Then the fifth criteria is that our political boundaries should be compact, so keeping things as close together as possible. And then six, we're required to not consider incumbency of any sitting political official or anyone that has declared their candidacy. So finally, we know we have those six criteria, but as a committee, we've gotten together and we've created a guiding principles document. And this elaborates on those principles and criteria and allows us to work together and think about how we will work with the consultant. It was really important to us to make sure that we sort of have a document that guided how we would do that. So as I said, this is just the beginning of the process. We're actually also required to have at least four public meetings, and we will have 5 public hearings. This is the first. The second is next Monday at the Silver Lake Community Center. The third meeting is February 22nd, that's a Tuesday at Nathan Bishop Middle School. The fourth is Monday, February 28th at the Da Vinci Center. And the fifth is going to be a fully remote meeting. Unlike tonight's meeting, we're in person and we have remote options, that will just be a virtual meeting. So what will happen is, once we have all of those hearings, we will then have a final meeting in which we will vote on new maps. After we gather feedback, people are presented the maps, we have an opportunity to view the maps. Once we vote on the maps, then it goes to the full city council, and there's still opportunity for the public to have feedback at that point in time. There will also be a public hearing from the full city council. And then after that public hearing, there are 2 meetings. The city council is required to vote twice to make the maps finalized. So all this is to say that there's lots of options and time for input. And we really do value the community's time and effort in helping us through this process. So that is all I have to say about all of the sort of nitty-gritty details of our committee. Do we know if our consultant has arrived yet?
They are moments away, as I understand.
Okay, great. For folks who are not aware, there is also a hearing at the State House right now on the State House maps. And I can give a brief overview of that process. The reason why we have to wait until February and March to do our maps is because in Rhode Island, traditionally, the state redraws its boundaries first. And so the state started their process last year, and they're in the process now. It has left their committee, and now they're in the process at the General Assembly level of voting on state boundary maps. And the state boundary lines will also come into to play in our lines where we're thinking about where boundaries should go. The final process, once the state finishes its boundaries, once we finish our boundaries, then the final process is to redraw the precincts, which are your voting and polling places. And the reason why you wait is you don't want to create these very small pocket precincts that have just a few people in them. You want to make sure that the polling place has as many people as possible in them. In Providence, we have roughly almost 80 polling places. And so we want to make sure that we're not creating polling places that have very few people in them. I see our consultant has arrived. Thank you all for bearing with us. What is your grand entrance?
And I just want to say, so everyone knows, this is the first time that the people on the committee are also seeing this presentation of the numbers from the census. So I'm gonna step into the audience so I can watch, but I'll come back, or committee members will come back up when it's time for the public comment.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, no problem. you running the slideshow?
Well, I would like to run it on Zoom. He's running it there.
Okay. I just need to know who, yes,
We're here.
okay,
I'll be back here though.
sounds good, okay, thank you there.
Not sure if that might work. It
Uh-oh.
definitely does.
Is this the one? Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. It's the blue one.
Access online or you otherwise get a copy of it somewhere.
Yes, I think Jessica's gonna put it up online.
Okay, we'll be the
It
access
will be,
online.
yeah, so we available on the website and we'll put it out.
Here, rub the button. I'm trying to save your hand over there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Okay.
important stuff, so definitely look at it.
When to start this. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Brace. I'm head of a company called Election Data Services. We have been involved with Rhode Island since the 1980s and have been involved with the city of Providence for the last several decades. And usually in terms of dealing with redistricting, but we also deal with things like census as well as election administration. So I want to get to the next slide. We do redistricting and we have for almost the entire nation. And there's some hit the next, there we go. So we compiled databases extensively of what's going on in redistricting all around the nation and have done those kind of databases for the last 4 decades in different states. Next slide. And we've been involved in more than 75, it's now up to about 84 court cases. I apologize for not being totally coherent because I just came back from 2 weeks in Alaska on a court case up there and took the red eye to get back here. So I apologize if, just ask me questions. That'll work out, I guess. Okay, next. Okay, so we have been involved with a lot of different things. I was heavily involved with election administration. I was Al Gore's expert witness down in Florida, dealing with punch card voting. So I've done a whole bunch of different things. We do collect data from the entire nation, and we put out a great big election poster every 2 years. Go ahead. And so for today, what I want to talk about is census and the racial categorizations that the Census Bureau utilizes. Because it's important to understand some of the dynamics and how to read census numbers and how to read census data. So, and we're going to talk about Providence and some of the data that we've seen in terms of Providence. And I want to share that with you. Next one. So, what you need to understand in terms of the elections process and how it relates, hold on. We look at total population, but not everybody that is in the total population counts because they have to be of voting age. And not everybody of voting age necessarily counts in terms of the census because they need to be citizen voting age for the purposes of election process. Next one. But not everybody can count the citizens voting age because they've got to be registered. So you need to register. Next one. And then you need to turn out. And turnout is key. But not everybody that turns out votes. Next one. Because the vote for president is less than the number of people that turn out. Next one. Other statewide offices are even less because of what's called drop off. Next one. Congressional is less. And finally, state legislature is less. And so this pyramid, this is what we call the stepping stones of the elections process, is important because it helps us understand some of the dynamics when we're dealing with redistricting. Next one. Because the demographic mix of the electorate changes in each of these stepping stones. It changes with each step, it changes with a different geography, and it changes over time. So the election in 2022 will be different than 2020, and different than 2018 and 16 and 14 and 12. All of these dimensions change every 2 years. So for the purposes of understanding the dynamics of how this stepping stone works in terms of redistricting, you need to take that into account and understand that. Next one. So it changes. So what's the census do for us? This is, oh, go back one. Oh, all right, sorry. Okay. The census asks two major questions. The first one they ask is, what is your race? And they give you a lot of different possibilities. It's grouped into major groupings in terms of white and African American and Asian and those kind of things. But the next thing they do, this was in 2010. Next one. In 2020, they changed some of the circumstances and did some more stuff with Spanish surname. So next one. This is the second question that is asked by the Census Bureau. What is are you of Hispanic origin? What is critical here is that Spanish origin is not a racial group. And so it's important to understand the distinctions between this, and it gives you different sets of numbers. And that's what I want to show you and talk to you about. Next one. In 2020, here's what they did for the racial side on the right-hand side. They asked a little bit more, but they gave you a lot more space to do the blank. And a lot of people did. So it provided some new dimensions to the census data. Now, they haven't given us all that data yet, but it certainly caused some things to happen, which I'll show you. Next one. Key thing to remember is that you can have up to 6 choices. You can check all 6. If you want to be white, you want to be black, you want to be Asian, you want to be American Indian, you want to do everything, you can. The Census Bureau lets you check any and all checkoffs on that side. That causes some fun for the data, and that's what I want to show you. So next one. So understanding census racial data and how it can be used in redistricting. First off, the top part, upper left, is some new and important data for you to understand as it relates to Providence. And this is, and I'm sitting here, I can't read the numbers, so I apologize. Hopefully you can read the numbers. You can end up. Oh, this is a new chart, sorry. So what this is up in the upper left-hand side. For the purposes,
He's asking for the lights to turn down. He can't see the screen is zoomed down.
yeah, turn down the lights.
Thank you.
A little bit better.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good. Okay, so what is key here is first, two different columns. The state legislature looked at the issue of prison gerrymandering. And the state legislature decided to take into account the prison gerrymander, those prisoners that are down in ACI, and take those into account to be able to put them back into their home residence. But for only part of them, they decided, and they determined in looking at the data that it's probably worthwhile to look at those that are in ACI for less than 2 years. Because in most of those less than 2-year inmates, they're on probation and will be out, and they'll be back at their homes. And so the legislature decided that they would look at the allocation of prisoners to their home just for those 41% of the population at ACI, that we could, one, determine what their address was. That was a big issue. But two, that indeed that they were going to be paroled before 2 years. And so we were able to get data from ACI to help us understand this dimension. And this is what we briefed the commission on. And extensively, we had 3 or 4 meetings to go over the ACI data. So, but the legislation that the legislature is considering, and I apologize for being here late because they had a meeting at 4 o'clock today that I had to testify at. But they ended up looking at and recommending, the commission did, recommending to the legislature that they reallocate prisoners for those less than 2 years at ACI. It's not everybody. That's a complaint, I know, but it is something that we could get some further definition of. And so the 2 columns are what is done pre-allocation and post-allocation for City of Providence. And it affects the number of people, the ideal number of people that are in each ward it's going to be. So the right-hand side is the one that you need to take a look at. And we're going to be drawing, if my eyesight is still good enough, 12,754 is the ideal district size for each ward that we're going to be looking at. Now, the courts have said that we have some latitude in terms of that number, that ideal district size. The courts have basically said that we have a overall 10% range to get within that ideal district size. And so what we've done here in this chart is show you what the overall 10% range, and the last 4 rows shows you what is the range that we have that would be acceptable to have wards within 12,100 and 13,300. That's the 5% deviation above and 5% deviation below. And so it is that range that we'll be looking at in terms of drawing the ward boundaries here in the city. Now, there are some additional dimensions here, and that deals with the race. We talked about that already. But what we've done is we've set up a whole series of tables that will be apparent, and we'll continue to talk about them in each of our board meetings. Of looking at the various tables of information, both in terms of total population and of voting age population. Because those stepping stones show us the change happens when you go just to that first stepping stone of voting age population. And so we have those as additional tables. And on the right-hand side, we have the categorizations of what we look at in terms of the race and the different ways that you could look at it and have the information in a tabular form. So next slide. This is the city of Providence. And this shows what has changed since 2010 to 2020. This is the percent growth that has happened. Both in terms of raw numbers, I think, and percentages. So you can see there has been change in the city of Providence. That's why we're doing redistricting. Because the courts have said that anybody that elects by districts needs to take into account the census data every 10 years and make changes to their district boundaries, in your instances, the wards. And so what we look at very first off is what is the shift and what is the change that has taken place since 2010 here in the city of Providence. And you can see that there has been a bunch of growth in the middle part of the city. And that's going to impact how we end up drawing the wards. Because those are going to be too heavy. They're going to have too many people in them. And they're going to end up needing to be changed. So next slide. This is what we were talking about in terms of the deviation and the windows that we have. So the raw number deviation on the left-hand side and the percent deviation on the right-hand side. And what you're looking at is you're trying to see what is close to the ideal, which are the lighter shades, and those that are farther away from the ideal, and those are in solid color. And so what you have is those that are the furthest away on the high side is in the more solid pink color. So that's 12 and 15. And then you've got what might be acceptable range. If you remember what I said, you have a 5% deviation. And so we want to see which wards might be close, but they don't have to change. And that would be the ones that are in that second categorization, either being underpopulated or overpopulated. Now, whenever I say that it might not have to change, inevitably something happens. And what that something is that you're sitting in the middle of the tidal wave. And there's population shifting going back and forth. The only safe harbor is those on the border. So Ward 7, that's within the 5% deviation. And it's kind of on the border. So maybe Ward 7 wouldn't have to change all that much. But there's a lot of change going on around it. So even Ward 7 might be having to have some small degree of change. Certainly Ward 12 and 15, they're overpopulated. They're going to have to purge voters to another ward. because there's too many people there. And those that are on the gray side, they're underpopulated. They've got to gain people. So those in Ward 9, Ward 9's got to gain people. So they're going to have to grow to get up and take more people into Ward 9. That's the way redistricting ends up working. So that you've got that added dimension of how do we balance things out. Some people have to gain territory and add new people because they are underpopulated and outside that 5% deviation, for example. And other people have to lose population because they're over that 5%. So that dimension is an important thing to recognize from the standpoint of understanding, why do we do redistricting? Why do we end up making these kind of changes? All right, next slide. So I mentioned to you that the census data shows a lot of different things. This is coming off of the PL 94-171. That is the census data that first comes out within a year of census day for the purposes of helping people do redistricting. If you remember, I mentioned to you that we have different racial categorizations. Next slide. So if we look at just race alone, you end up seeing in this sample jurisdiction, this is not Providence. And I'm going to show you Providence, but I created these to go through and talk a little bit about the various component pieces. So what you have in this instance is that you have white, black, American Indian, Asian, and Pacific Islander, and then they have a category of some other race. They left a blank space, you could write in on what some other race is. But if you remember, I mentioned that you could select more than 2 races. So in this jurisdiction, 2% or almost 3% of the people marked 2 or more races. When you look at that data, that adds to 100%. But that is for race alone. What's missing here? We don't see Hispanics, right? So, next slide. Hispanics make up 26% of that jurisdiction. So do you add the 26% to the 100%? Try to tell the court that we've got 126% of the people. That's kind of hard to explain on that side. What the Census Bureau does do for us, though, is that they allow us in the data that they provide to be able to split things apart. And so that's what we have done. So next slide. When you take into account the Hispanic population with on the Hispanic side, that second line, what you end up seeing is that when you add that in and then you look at non-Hispanic white and non-Hispanic black and non-Hispanic Asian, non-Hispanic American Indian, you can take the Hispanic out of the various races so that you've got Hispanics as a separate category. And when you do that, you get back to 100%. So it's an important dimension to understand that when you're looking at racial data, are you looking at the racial data with or without Hispanics taking into account? And there is inevitably, I've seen lots of different presentations and talked to many different jurisdictions. Sometimes they don't take into account the Hispanic, and sometimes they do. But you get two different numbers. And that can be the problem sometimes. So we can see that we can take Hispanics out. It's going to impact the two or more. It's going to certainly impact most dramatically the some other race, because what the Census Bureau shows is that about 51% of the Hispanic population marked some other race. They didn't see Hispanic in it, so they just marked some other race. So when you take Hispanics out of this and look at non-Hispanic some other race, it goes to the floor. That only accounts for about 51%. The rest of the Hispanics ended up marking white. And you see how the white population decreases there too, when you take into account Hispanic. It's an important distinction, and to understand when you're looking at the data and what the best way of understanding the data and understanding the dynamics behind the data. Next slide. So remember I mentioned to you that people could mark more than two races. Well, the Census Bureau also told us which of the two, or which of the three, or which of the four, or which of the six, and how many people mark those. And so we can allocate those out to the races and take that into account to basically bring that two or more race down by taking into account the multiple races. But what happens when you do? Next slide. You get more than 100%. This is where you end up having two or more races that are having a factor in the data. And so we call this the combo way of looking at things. The first two lines are called the alone. That's race alone categorizations. And then these are combo categorizations in combination of the different races. What that does is increase each of the races, because it marked Black and Asian. Well, you're going to be counted in both categories under the combo factor. So we're able to see that. Next slide. If you take into account the Hispanic side of the question, it brings down some of that combo, but it's still sitting at 101 because of the combo. Next slide. Now, as it is appropriate, I guess, the federal government wants to stick its head into data too. And the OMB issued guidelines on how the federal government should look at the multi-race question. What they said in their guidelines is that you count the multiple races for the races that it is the predominant characteristic. Okay. When you do that, you get less than 100%. So in this instance, 99%. Next slide. When you deal with the Hispanics, you're still at less than 100%. These are the different ways that you can look at census data. All of them are correct. There's no magic answer here. They're all correct. Depends on how you want to look at this data. So you can make whatever argument you want to make and position you want to have. Just understand that you're going to have different data. And understanding the dimensions of that impacts the redistricting process. Next slide. You can also do this for voting age population. So you see the dimensions of how that changes. Remember those stepping stones of how things change at each step of the stepping stone. You see that the dimensions of the racial groups change in each case. Okay, next slide. This is Rhode Island. So you can see with Rhode Island, this is for, yep. So this is the 2020 data. What you see in terms of Rhode Island is that 9% of the voters or the people that answered the census answered 2 or more race. Remember what it was for that fictional city? It was not even close to that. So we've got a lot more of 2 or more races. And we have some considerations in terms of how to deal with the combo numbers. In Rhode Island, you're up at 105%, a lot more than it was in 2010. It's an added dimension of what's happening in this country as people start reflecting more of their racial categorizations, their racial heritage. And so it makes an impact in terms of the data. You can see that both in terms of total population and voting age population. Next slide. This is Providence. This is what we counted in 2020. I'm sorry, 2010. So this is the way that we had the data for 2010. And you can see for Providence, for the combo, we were up at 103%. The multiple race categorizations. So what happened this decade? Next slide. This is 2020. Look at the growth in the Hispanic population. That had a more significant impact here in the city. And you see that these multiple races and the combos increase that combo categorization. Those are the dimensions that we have to deal with now as we look at redistricting and how to understand some of the dimensions of the census data and understanding what can be done on redistricting. Next slide. So this is what has changed. And well, this is what's going on with voting age population for 2020. And we were looking at this from the standpoint of what is the majority population and what is the plurality population by race. And the numbers that are inside the individual wards are the second largest racial group. So you can see where Hispanics are very much on the south side and the west side of the city. And it's predominantly white and non-white elsewhere. But you can see the numbers that are in each of the wards to see what is the second highest percentage. So that's an important distinction, an important characteristic for us to understand and look at how best to analyze how to do redistricting here in the city and what impact that might have. But clearly looking at the difference between 2010 and 2020, you can take a look and see how the changes have happened within a bunch of the wards. The fourth ward, look at the dimensions of that and how the fourth ward has changed, particularly for the second highest group. That's a phenomenon that we didn't see in 2010, but clearly the increase in the Hispanic population has had an impact. And now Hispanics plurality, right? Yeah. So Hispanics are the plurality. I'm sorry, my eyesight on sideways reading is a little bit dicey. So it's that dimension of what has been the change that's important to understand on that side. And the census data lets us see that. And we can see that by ward, we can see that down in the census plot. Down here in front of you is a map that shows it for every single block in the city. And what is the majority and the plurality in that particular block. So find your street, find your pattern, figure out where you are on that map. And you can see what the census data has told us about you in that regard. Next slide. That's it. That gives you an added dimension. What we're all going to be clear on redistricting. And I think what is important for everybody to understand is that your participation is most important. And your input into this process is most important. So that is why they have set up the commission, the committee, to deal with this. And I know that they're very interested in getting the input of everyone. So, Jessica, back to you.
Ziggy, would you be able to push those lights back up here, please? Thank you, Kim and Ryan, for that. I really appreciate the detail and how to use the census data, how we'll be thinking about the census data. You don't have to answer this now, but I'd love to know a little bit about which race grouping we did use in 2010. And then I'd like to go to public comment, because I know we have lots of folks here who would like to speak.
What we ended up in 2010 is the same that we're doing in 2020. We're showing everything. We want to let people understand the dimension of the data without colorizing it one way or the other, but to have information that anybody can argue with or talk about or understand, more importantly. And so that's what we presented in 2010 and presented in 2020. We actually presented in 1990 and in 1980 on that side. It was a little bit different dimension back in 1980, but it's always been my belief of trying to give as much information to everyone, the public, to the politicians, to whoever wants it, to try to get some understanding of what is the dimensions of the data.
Well, we really appreciate it, and I thank everyone for your patience and for bearing with us, and Kim and Ryan, thank you for giving us that presentation, and I know that today's been a tight time, and so we really do appreciate your time and effort. Can I please have the list of who will be? Yes. And we have 5 on the list, but if you are interested, if you're here and you didn't get a chance to sign in, we'd be happy to have you also speak. So the first is Yadira Rivera. You're okay? Okay. Okay. Councilman Correa, would you like to speak? Thank you for joining us this evening. And also thank you to Councilman Vargas.
Michael Carrera. Good evening, Madam Chair, committee members, colleagues. I want to thank you for having this first presentation tonight here. I think it's a very positive thing. 10 years ago, we went through this, and it started off nice, that too much politics got played into this. And as you can see, Ward 6 suffered because I did not agree to what was happening to other neighborhoods throughout the city. And at the very last moment, someone decided that they were going to come in and chop up Ward 6. So I've been representing the Ward 6 neighborhood now for 11 years. And in my neighborhood, my constituents don't have a playground or a neighborhood park that they could call home for their children and whatnot. We don't have a neighborhood school. That was taken out of the ward as well. Our senior high-rise buildings, all four, were taken out of Ward 6. If the residents in my neighborhood want to hold a community meeting, I need to go to another neighborhood and get another council person's permission to hold a community event or a community meeting. And it's just not fair. What was done to Ward 6 in the last redistricting is a shame. It's a shame for what was done to the residents of Ward 6. And I hope that this committee and Mr. Brace can rectify what was done 10 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. I would like to note from the committee that part of our guiding principles document includes some language. We had discussed this previously about trying to consider that each neighborhood should have a place to host each ward should have a place to host a community meeting and a place where neighbors can gather. That will be part of our consideration, and we hope that we can rectify that.
Thank you.
Next, I have Joseph Buchanan.
My name is Joseph P. Buchanan. I am president of the Fund for Black Political Progress. I would like to thank the board, especially Councilwoman Kay, and the other lovely councilwoman there, as well as I guess these consultants, because we never had a good consultant, so I don't really know how to actually let these guys now. But I'm up here to speak for my black community. I don't know what these other community groups have done or haven't done. But I know they haven't reached the grassroots people in my neighborhood. I'm talking about the homeless. I'm talking about the black unemployed. I'm talking about the black underhoused. And I hope that this panel is really considering about the way the blacks are being misrepresented. In my opinion, as far as getting our votes diluted, because they're splitting us up from the east side to the south side to the west side to wherever. I want to make sure that blacks are assured that we're going to have seats in the state house in the city of Providence. Because the way it's looking, it doesn't look like there's going to be too many black folks elected in the city or the state. And I want you to know that it's going to be a problem. As far as I'm concerned, my organizations are concerned, and some of the black political people in this community and in the state of concerned. Right now, I know we're dealing with the city, but I know it's going to come across in the statewide election. And I don't want any of you to be in the way of the storm that's coming up. So I hope you will listen to the people and what we're saying. God bless you.
Thank you, sir. Next on list, we have Santos Javier.
Santos Javier. So I have 3 questions. First of all, I want to thank the community for being here, what you guys are doing, your hard work. So I have 3 questions. One is, when will these be finalized? The second question I have, I don't know if you're gonna answer that one, and the next one, you want me to go through them, maybe you guys will answer that.
So, we will not have final maps until middle of March. That will be coming out of our committee, and then from there, they go to the city council. And so we are thinking April, there will be finalized maps. We have to have the maps finalized by May to meet a deadline at the state level for when people need to register to vote in order to register to, for the election, yes, sorry. They need to register to vote in a particular district so that they can then register to potentially be a candidate. So we're working on that deadline as well. So we have to be done by May, but the time we'll definitely have finalized maps from the city council perspective by May, coming out of our committee by mid-March.
And that will jump to my next questions. When will and how will individually people will be notified? How will they be notified and when? Like, are they going to be like send a letter? You belong not to this ward, like this city they were in one ward and now they find themselves in another ward. How will they know?
That's a very great question. So what happens is once your ward is changed, actually, not even if your ward is changed, if your polling place changes, then you're notified by the board of canvassers what your new polling place is, and that will come in a postcard or a letter in the mail from the board of canvassers. So the way the process works is once the city council finalizes those maps, then the board of canvassers redraws the precincts, which are the voting precincts. And once those precincts are redrawn, then they will send a postcard letting people know their new precinct, and I believe the new ward is likely on that as well.
And then my final questions, that will actually do a final question. Will they be like different maps for the city council to vote in, or just one map? Because I know that on the state level, they have two maps, A, B, and I think they have C too. I think they have three kind of maps and they have to decide which they're going to vote on. So are we going to have the same situation where there's going to be multiple maps and then one is going to be chosen?
Yes, yes, we will. We will have multiple versions. And if we receive comment and feedback that says that those maps should be updated or changed slightly, then we intend to do that, and then those will be a different version of map.
And that's my final question. Thank you, guys.
On the list, we have the fifth speaker is Gerard Catalia.
First, thank everyone for taking the time and coming out this evening. Yes, my name is Gerard Catala, lifelong Ward 9 resident. I didn't know if I was going to speak or not tonight, so I actually my name down just in case. All right, well, I'm gonna work with this. So I was going to speak, but I guess after the presentation, it raised a lot of questions, and after the last gentleman who just asked several questions, it raised even more questions. So here's my concern. First of all, it's an election year, and I can't understand why or how during an election year you're going to at the last minute tell potential voters or potential candidates that they may or may not actually live in the ward in which they've already been campaigning for. I don't know how that's going to be remedied. If you're saying March, April, or May, and in July you have to, already petition for candidacy, that doesn't give one much time. So that's a problem right there. I don't know if you want to address that, or I don't know what you want to consider that as a rhetorical question. Has that even been brought up?
Actually, I appreciate the question. One thing to know, what's interesting about Rhode Island, because we have such a late primary, we actually have the benefit of this process having some more time. States that have earlier primaries actually have already gone through the process very quickly. So fortunately, we have a later primary that enables people to at least have that opportunity to register.
Yeah, I will also say,
I went, oh, I'm on, so two things. One, you know, that's something that's been certainly on all of our minds. We don't, there's not, this isn't a choice to do this year, right? Like we are required by charter to do this redistricting the year after the census. Now, COVID got in all of our ways, in all of the ways, all the time, right? We know that. But it also made the census data numbers come out later. And it meant the state, which we know Providence has to wait for the state to do its districting. Everything got pushed back quite a bit. So nonetheless, we would be doing this. I had the same question when we started Board Boundaries. I was like, how do we do this in an election year, right? And the reality is, it's always like every 10 years, whenever the election year matches up with the every 10 years, this is what we're in. And so I think, you know, the best answer is that we will work here in these public spaces to include all of the community voices that we can as part of the discussion. When City Council has a proposal in front of it and goes out to public hearing, again, we'll include all of those voices and we will have them out well before the filing deadline. And, you know, that's where we're at.
Yes, no, so I understand that, but I mean, there's some folks who've already announced their candidacy, and you're saying that they're going to be on the campaign trail for 4 months or longer, and just to find out that they don't actually live in the ward in which they've been campaigning in. What happens in that case? I mean, and if we're saying COVID's say we had a year after the census was 2 years ago. If COVID was the very reason that this was all put on hold, then to me, it would seem the right thing to do is to have the redistricting next year after the election, because we can continue to keep it on hold like it has been for the last year.
Yeah, the charter, it's the city.
Yes, the charter says that it has to be done a year after the census. We're already 2 years after the census, correct? Census in 2020, correct?
It has to be done a year after we receive the data. So the census data is a year later. So we receive, yeah.
Okay, that's different. I think you said it'd be done a year after the census.
Yes, I'm sorry, we're talking locally when what we're meaning is that a year after the census data comes to us. Or the census data comes to us a year after, so it's the year that we receive the census data.
Okay, so I have a question for Mr. Brace.
You can.
Oh,
yeah, sure.
my apologies, if I was out of order.
Okay.
So my question is, and I'm looking for some clarity. So in the slide, it said that inmates who are serving 2 years or less, somewhat relatively nonviolent crimes, they are placed on the voter rolls for the community in which they lived in at the time that they were incarcerated. How does that work?
Great question. So what Mr. Grace and Mr. Taylor did was they were able to get all of the data from the BCI that included the last known address of the people who were at the ACI as of April 1st, 2020, because that was the day of the census. So the census, you count everyone where they are on April 1st of each decennial year. And so they were able to get the addresses of many of those people, but not all of them. So for the people in which they had legitimate addresses that were able to find an address, and for people who only had that 2 years from the census, we placed them back into the census blocks in which that address came from. So it's not the rural roll, it's back on this into the census block. So essentially what happens is those people were counted in Cranston, and we took the data from Cranston and we brought it back to Providence. So Providence now has 1,000 or so more in population than we would have if we did not go through the process of moving those people.
Okay, yeah, so I'm glad to clarify that. But I actually think that's worse, because now we're putting them into the population, we're adding them, but we're not even affording them the right to vote for who their respective officials are going to be.
So I think that what we're doing, so if we don't know anything about their voting status, the process we're using doesn't use voting data, it only uses census data. We are using the 2-year timer because then they would be back into the community by that point in time. And if they choose, they can go on the voter rolls, because in Rhode Island, after a certain period of time, you are allowed to vote again.
Yeah, okay, so here's my final question. You said that all wards have to be as close to equal in population as possible, correct? So if a certain geographical location has more people in it, we can't tell someone to change their address, so that's why they redraw the district lines to add others in to that location, balancing the wards, correct? So here's the problem. We have people in prison who are not actually in that location. Someone else actually lives in that address, if that address is even still in existence. And that goes against the very community that they're being added to, which allows other communities who have less people in it to come and take land from this so-called more populous geographical location that isn't even technically more populated, because these people are incarcerated and they can get up and move to the actual ward which just took the land. How do we justify that?
I think we can ask if there's a way to see how the neighborhoods are impacted. I'm so sorry.
So I think we can certainly ask our consultants to give us a breakdown of how folks who are currently incarcerated, how adding them back into the neighborhood impacts the neighborhoods. I gotta say, so this was a decision made on the state level, and I am so happy that they made it this way, because when we think about our city as a whole, and the very unfortunate rate of incarceration in our city, right? We're talking about, in a way, by not counting folks in Providence, we're like unhoming people, right? We're saying that folks are part of our city, and they very much are, even if they're incarcerated. So this is I'd be interested in seeing how that breakdown works, so like neighborhood for neighborhood, and I think that's worth thinking about and taking into account. But it's a state law that I'm very happy has made it into the process for what it's worth.
Yeah, you know what, I'm gonna yield my time, but I definitely think there needs to be a greater conversation in general, but specifically with regards to how, you know, we're adding inmates to the rolls, and then allowing other communities to come and take land just because we added these numbers. To me, that seems unfair. I think we all know that that's unfair, if we're not, you know, pretending to ourselves. So I'd like to know how I can get more involved, how I can be more active, especially with regards to this redistricting. Just like the councilman said earlier, it was a shame and very shady, and you know what they did to him over there in Ward 6. You know, that guy, yeah, you know, that very, very bad last minute turnaround. So, you know, we need to figure this out as a city. You know what I mean? Before, you know, we suffer. You know, we're in this together. So again, I appreciate you guys coming up this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you very much. And let's chat after, tell you how to get more involved. Thank you so much for sticking it out with us this evening. Does anyone else?
Actually, I wanted to.
Of course.
I wrote it down so I don't lose my thoughts, but my name is Jadera Rivera. So I just want to say, you know, I'm a relatively new resident of Providence, I guess going on almost 2 years. And, it's right here in the Upper South. I love my neighborhood. People are resilient and there's passion and they're tough. It's no secret that each section differs, so the south side to the east side, huge difference. But from what I gather in South Providence, people are constantly having to adapt to changes without much say. And so this redistricting and census represents more change, if anything. And in my neighborhood alone, I know there's a luxury apartment complex that's going to be made. It's 178 units. It's going to be across the street from the Ronald McDonald House. And while many will celebrate this, right? My concern is that there's more change being applied again to a neighborhood of residents that already feel invisible and don't feel like they're heard. So while this redistricting, happens every 10 years or so, my hope is that changes implemented will benefit those who have history in the neighborhood versus those who will be coming in. And the changes are happening as a result of those coming in, but we can't forget those who've already been here and who have been forced to adapt. And so current residents, and I'm going to speak to the south side because that's where I live, should be given the respect, right, and that they rightfully earned and should be considered when redistricting. Because once again, a lot of the changes that happen through the city that I've noticed in my almost 2 years here is as a result of people already who have history and deep-rooted history having to change and having to adapt instead of people coming in adapting to how things are. And so that, for what it's worth, should be noted.
My name is Mary Kay Harris. I represent Ward 11, in fact, in your district. I totally understand what you're saying, and I think it's very important that we take in consideration. And we talked about this a lot as a committee, displacement, and people who will be getting pushed out. I think a lot of that is a lot of conversation that we as a committee really have taken serious and considered to take serious going forward. We do know that Ward 11 have had a lot of strikes against this, and a lot of people being displaced in so many ways. So this is really, really important that you bringing that interest to the table is important for us. We definitely need to be able to value a lot of people's opinions, especially the interest of where we live. I worry about that every day, and I've lived in South Providence all my life. And I definitely worry about having a leak. So thank you. Thank you for that very important point. I just wanted to say that it's important.
Do we have anyone else who would like to speak this evening? Okay, hearing none, I think we can wrap up this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. Yes.
One people are there.
Yes, okay, so as I said in the beginning, this is just the start. This is just the start of the journey. We have meetings coming up every week for the next 5 weeks, public hearings, and then another meeting. So next week,
Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day.
It's your Valentine's Day too.
We are going to celebrate. We have a website, it is on the city council webpage right at the top. You can click a link right at the top of the city council to the city. If you want to email us at boardboundaries@providenceri.gov. You can follow us on any social media. The city council social media streams are streaming it. We have flyers out. I encourage you to tell your friends, tell your neighbors, talk to your family about this. It's a really important process. Please feel free to chat with us after. I want to give a very special thanks to our consultants and to all of the city staff that are here tonight. Also to my fellow committee members, and we have two city councilors who joined us. Thank you, Councilman Vargas and Councilman Correa. Thank you, everyone. I wish everyone a good night. Stay dry. I think it might still be raining. Take your time driving home and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.